Hey guys, welcome to P-Bank's Curiosity. So, with all the rage about Joe Biden, him being too old and his mental capacity, I did some research into world leaders who have had similar health issues in the past, and it was pretty spooky what I discovered. Did you know that the elderly president of Germany in 1933 made some classical old man mistakes that led to the creation of the Nazi Empire? Did you know that Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union, had health issues that led to Joseph Stalin's murderous 30-year rule? And did you know that it was an old president who had similar health problems to Joe Biden who actually led to the downfall of the Soviet Union? If the answer is no, then let me show you. So the first person I want to show you is Paul Von Hindenburg. So Mr. Hindenburg was the president of Germany from 1925 until his death in 1934. So not many people know much about him. However, do you notice those years, 1925 to 1934? Anything strikes you familiar about those years? That's right. World War II started in 1939, and Mr. von Hindenburg, he was the last president before Hitler took complete control. The thing is, he was not a fan of Hitler either. However, he was an old, sick man, and he made some fateful errors which actually led to the creation of the Nazi regime, which then led on to World War II as we all know it. So von Hindenburg, he was a field marshal at the start of World War I, and he became famous throughout Germany after his victory in the Battle of Tannenburg in August 1914. He was promoted to Chief of Staff for the remainder of the campaign, and despite Germany's defeat in World War I, the public still regarded Hindenburg as a hero. Following Germany's defeat in World War I, Hindenburg he decided to retire due to his advancing age. However, in 1925, the president at the time, Friedrich Ebert, he suddenly died after an operation to remove his appendix. So, an election had to be held within a month, and none of the candidates held the required majority. So, FYI, following World War I, Germany had transitioned to a type of government that required parties to form coalitions amongst each other, rather than just having one party wins the election and one party rules. And the group of conservative parties, they needed a new candidate pretty quick. And they decided on Paul von Hindenburg because of his really good reputation, even though he was 77 years at the time. So on April 1st, 1925, a delegation went to his house to convince Paul von Hindenburg to come out of retirement and lead the right-wing coalition. He responded right there and then, "If you feel that my election is necessary for the sake of the fatherland, I'll run in God's name." So on 26th of April 1925, he won the second election and officially begun his term as president of Germany. So at this moment, the German population was still quite bitter about the reparations they had to pay following World War I, as well as their territorial losses and the overall economic decline. Hindenburg was able to stabilize the country somewhat. However, there was only so much he could do given the state of the country. With his first heart attack in World War I in 1916, he always had issues with his heart and he constantly complained of chest pain. However, then he started getting other issues such as arthritis, which limited his mobility. During the later part of the 1920s, his mental capacity started to decline quite a bit. And even though it was only considered to be mild in nature, it was enough for him to become dependent on his advisors. And guess who swooped in to take advantage of that situation? It was Hitler. Hindenburg, he was a traditional conservative who believed in the Constitution, and he disliked the radical movements such as the Nazis. However, in 1932, the Nazi Party accumulated the most votes for the lower house election, also known as the Reichstag, with 37%. This was not enough for Hitler to gain the chancellorship outright, so he still had to win over the support of Hindenburg and pass a confidence vote. Despite Hindenburg's dislike for Hitler and his ideology, the conservative politicians Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, who were not Nazis, convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor because they thought he could be controlled. Now that was a fateful error. So Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933. And then 28 days later, there was a fire at the parliament called the Reichstag fire that was attributed to the Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe. And then Hitler conveniently used this fire as a pretext to force Hindenburg to implement the Enabling Act, which would give Hitler dictatorial powers in such an emergency. Remember, at this stage, Hindenburg was 85 years old, and he was heavily dependent on his advisors, and his advisors suggested to approve Hitler's request for the Enabling Act. So against his own instinct, Hindenburg approved, and Hitler gained the power to bypass the lower house with any law that he wanted. And within the blink of an eye, Hitler rushed through a bunch of laws and transformed Germany into the Nazi state he so desperately wanted. A little over a year later, Hindenburg passed away, and Hitler, he used that as an opportunity to merge together the Chancellor and the President to make himself the supreme leader of Germany. Hitler then introduced a new law which required all members of the army and the government to pledge loyalty to him. And we all know what happens next. So there you have it. Did you know that it was an old sick man who was pressured to appoint Hitler in charge, and pretty much led to the start of World War II?
Und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!
So next up is Vladimir Lenin, the communist leader of the Soviet Union who turned the country into a communist state. Also guys, if you like this content, please click like and subscribe. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets maybe penalized due to the content. So yeah, greatly appreciated if you can click like and subscribe. So in Lenin's later years in power, he experienced some serious mental and physical health problems, which really limited his capacity to rule the Union. So similar to what happened in Germany, an evil genius saw that as an opportunity and swooped in to take advantage. This evil genius I'm talking about is Joseph Stalin, who would rule the Union for the following 30 years with an iron fist, pretty much killing anyone or torturing them, anyone who would pose a threat to his rule. So for the record, Lenin, he pretty much controlled everything. He controlled the economy, he controlled the army, and he actually disliked Stalin quite a bit, so much so that he wanted him kicked out of the party. And so, yeah, it's how did this guy weasel his way into the most powerful position within the Union? So anyway, I'll show you how. So Vladimir Lenin, he came to prominence during the 1917 October Revolution, which was the revolution to overthrow the existing Tsar government. His party, the Bolsheviks, went on to seize power from the existing government, and they nationalized all industry, turning Russia into the communist state he so desperately envisioned. He then went on to name himself as leader of Soviet Russia, and things were looking pretty rosy for Lenin at this point, until August 30th, 1918. Everything came crashing down when Fanny Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, she tried to assassinate Lenin while he was leaving a Moscow factory. So Kaplan, she fired several shots at Lenin, hitting him twice, once in the neck and the other one in the shoulder. So the bullet in his neck caused damage to his vocal cords and his throat, leading to difficulties with speech and articulation, and he experienced ongoing speech problems for the remainder of his life. Only 4 years later, they decided to remove the bullets from his body, and it's been suggested that for the 4-year period that these bullets were stuck in his body, the bullets actually oxidized within his body, which is what caused all these other bad health effects. And unfortunately, not much had changed after his surgery, and the doctors believed he had some severe damage to his central nervous system and his heart. Little over a month later, Lenin, he experienced his worst stroke to date, which left him temporarily paralyzed. So Lenin, he found it difficult to concentrate and make decisions. However, he did recuperate somewhat, which enabled him to get back involved into politics somewhat. He helped the government eradicate a number of competing groups, such as the Mensheviks, and he started to implement strategies to overcome over-bureaucracy, claiming in one letter that we are being sucked into a foul bureaucratic swamp. Interesting, that quote though, because wasn't it Trump who had the phrase drain the swamp in 2016? I don't know, is Trump a history buff? Or is that just a common thought about governments people have? Anyway, so Lenin, his sporadic involvement in politics sort of worked against him, because this just gave Joseph Stalin time to start plotting his evil magic. Lenin actually believed that the leader of the Red Army, Leon Trotsky, he believed that he was actually a more suitable leader, and recommended that Joseph Stalin should be removed from his position as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. However, when Lenin wasn't around, Joseph Stalin used that time to consolidate his power by appointing his cronies into prominent positions, and he used that time as well to cultivate an image as he was Lenin's best mate and deserving successor. Stalin also started to control who had access to Lenin, to further isolate him and dictate the narrative. Then, in March 1923, Lenin, he had his third stroke, which left him partially paralyzed on his right side. However, this time it was much worse than before, because he could barely speak. He could barely understand what people were saying. So Lenin, he somehow came back from the dead again, and he recuperated, and not completely, but enough to have one last attempt to oust Joseph Stalin in a famous document called the Testament. So the Testament was a document produced by Lenin which heavily criticized Joseph Stalin. However, Stalin had enough of his cronies in power to suppress the document from being circulated within the party, and soon enough, Lenin he slipped into a coma and died in January 1924. If Lenin tried a bit earlier to focus on transitioning of power to his preferred candidate, who knows, history could have been very different. Instead, after his death, there was an internal struggle within the party, and luckily for Stalin's sake, he had enough of his cronies in the right positions to withstand this internal conflict, and ultimately he was victorious. So my thoughts after all this is, what do you think is happening in the Democratic Party right now? Is there an internal struggle for influence within the party? Are people isolating Biden and dictating the internal narrative to further their own cause? And it makes you think, man, politics is a pretty dirty game.
Any pugilist worth his salt knows when someone's on the ropes. That's when you throw a combination to the gut and a left hook to the jaw.
Next on this list, we have Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982. And he was a well-known and trustworthy ruler who would reach decisions through consensus and collective leadership. And he was also a stud of a man as well, when you look at this photo. Though he was well regarded by his peers, he did experience some significant cognitive and heart health issues. And many historians contribute these health problems to the fall of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev first joined the Soviet Communist Party in 1923, and he worked a number of low to mid-level administrative positions up until World War II started in 1941. He then served various administration positions during World War II before returning to the Communist Party in 1946. Over the next 20 years, he served various leadership roles within the Communist Party, and he had relative success with the reconstruction programs in Ukraine, collective agriculture in Moldova, and he was even involved in the Soviet space program and the nuclear arms program. Brezhnev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1964, and he immediately stuck to the teachings of the Marxist-Leninist communist ideology. He was such a traditionalist, he tried to even bring back the Soviet kiss by pretty much bashing every dude he met. This photograph also led to the famous graffiti painting on the Berlin Wall by Dmitry Verbal in 1990. Just out of interest, this German title reads, "My God, help me survive this deadly love." So anyway, the stock standard Soviet approach, it worked for some time. However, coincidentally, in the 1970s, his health got really bad, and that's the same time that the economy started to deteriorate and corruption became rife throughout the party. His health problems included chronic deterioration of his central nervous system, several strokes, he had insomnia, addiction to sleeping pills and tranquilizers, he had multiple heart attacks, he had gout, leukemia, emphysema, and even chronic bronchitis. He was often seen walking shakily, fumbling his words and forgetting things. For example, here is a picture of Brezhnev and President Nixon looking pretty surprised at how a pen works. Luckily for Brezhnev, his team of doctors and subordinates, they did a great job at covering up the extent of his health problems, which is one of the main reasons why he managed to stay in power for so long. However, Brezhnev, he became quite dependent on his advisors, and he was unable to enact any type of reform that was necessary to cure the Union's many problems. From 1975 onwards, their GDP growth plummeted to 1 to 2% per year. And if it wasn't for their outright illegal counterfeiting of Western technology, the growth rate probably would have been closer to zero, if not negative. For example, here is the IBM System 360 mainframe computer. It was released in 1964, and it took the Soviet Union 4 years to copy the Americans and release the ES-EVM computer mainframe in 1968. However, they must not have copied it well enough because the ES-EVM was a heap of junk and pretty much no one wanted to buy it. There was a huge shortage of goods across the Union, and if it wasn't for opening up food imports from countries such as the US, Australia and Brazil, the Union probably would have plunged into a famine. And funny enough, countries in the Eastern Bloc, such as Estonia, actually became more advanced and had a better quality of living than Russia itself. So naturally, in Russia, everyone started protesting at the lack of goods and services that were available. Yet the government, they couldn't really do anything because Brezhnev, he was too unwell all the time to bring about any sort of reform at any capacity. With their activity in the Afghanistan war, supporting the North Vietnamese, and the arms race with the US, as well as importing lots of food from the rest of the world, the Soviet Union took out massive loans from Western countries to stay afloat. And with no active leadership, a lot of this money just got swallowed up by corruption in the Communist Party. Somehow, Brezhnev, he managed to hold on to power until November 10th, 1982, when he died of a heart attack. By this stage, the Soviet Union was well overdue for reform, and they had billions of dollars of debt. Successive presidents after Brezhnev tried to enact reform, however, it was too little too late. And when Mikhail Gorbachev tried to rescue the empire by converting the economy to a free market economy, the Union collapsed. It's widely agreed upon that if these market reforms actually happened earlier during the Brezhnev's reign of stagnation, then the Union might have been saved. However, with his many health problems affecting his leadership, pretty much nothing got done and the ship never corrected course. So when comparing this to the US today, the American economy is much stronger. However, it does have a 124% debt to GDP ratio. And there's also things such as the Ukraine war, the conflict in Palestine, the whole Taiwan thing as well. And the debt just keeps going up and up and up. Could Biden's lack of involvement create a lack of foresight and lead the US to a similar type of fate of the Soviet Union? What are your thoughts? So if you're thinking, but Patrick, how could anyone do anything? How could anyone fix this situation? I think I have the solution, which brings me to the final person on my list, Antonio Salazar, the dictator of Portugal. Antonio Salazar, he was the dictator of Portugal from 1932 until 1968, when he suffered a severe stroke and went into a coma. With Salazar incapacitated, the president at the time, Americo Tomas, considered that he would die soon, and so on the 25th of September, he replaced Salazar with Marcelo Caetano. However, unexpectedly, Salazar, he came out of his coma about a month later, and he started to recuperate somewhat, and he was able to have basic conversations with his aides and his support staff. Unlike other dictators throughout history, Salazar was actually quite well liked throughout Portugal, and his aides didn't have the heart to tell him that he had lost power. So, they decided to actually pretend every day that he was still in charge. They actually created fake versions of the local newspaper each day, and they actually carried out fictional stories to make it seem like he was still in charge. This might be the key for Joe Biden. You just need to put him into a home that looks